Alrighty, hello everyone. So this is our next video in the Module 1B series, which is meant to review and supplement Chapter 2 of your textbook, which provides an introduction to cognitive neuroscience. So in this particular video, we're going to again discuss this idea of specialization of function, but instead of focusing on individual neurons that specialize in a particular aspect of cognition, we're going to broaden our scope a little bit, so to speak, and now we're going to focus on individual structures of the brain that carry out specific aspects of cognition. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, just to provide a review of sorts, when we talk about cognitive neuroscience, we're attempting to investigate and understand the physiological basis of cognition, or put even more simply, we're trying to figure out what is happening in the brain and central nervous system when we are engaging in some sort of cognitive process like thinking, remembering, communicating, etc. So what are the, can we measure the increases or decreases in brain activity as we're carrying out these tasks as a means of understanding how these physiological changes relate to cognition. Okay, so again, returning to this idea of specialization of function, essentially what specialization of function, that central hypothesis or question that we're attempting to explore is, are individual neurons, groups of neurons, or various structures in the brain specialized or localized to carry out various cognitive processes? So can we pinpoint individual structures in the brain as being the origin or the neural architecture that allows for specific types of cognition? Okay, so the first brain region that I'd like to talk about that seems to support this notion of localization of function, or this idea that we can pinpoint certain aspects of cognition to specific brain regions, is the fusiform face area. So you guys have already watched a video talking about the FFA. So the FFA is a region of the temporal lobe, as you know, that seems to be specialized specifically for recognition of faces. Right? And there's a lot of evidence that seems to support that interpretation. So for example, if we stick people in a brain scanner and show them pictures of faces, that particular region of the temporal lobe, the FFA, shows increased patterns of brain activity that aren't present if the individual is looking at other pictures, like pictures of nature scenes or pictures of basic objects, right? So that's pretty compelling evidence, particularly because that particular experiment has been replicated many, many times with many different types of people. Also, a compelling piece of evidence that seems to support the idea that the fusiform face area is a specific brain structure that specializes in recognition of faces is that individuals who have damaged this particular region of the brain as a result of stroke or some sort of traumatic brain injury are no longer able to recognize faces. So for example, the famous neurologist Oliver Sacks, the late famous neurologist Oliver Sacks, he had prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize faces, because he had damaged this particular region of the brain. So in order for him to recognize people, because he couldn't go off of their individual faces, he learned to recognize other sort of characteristics. So for example, he would go off of the particular sound of their voice, the tone or projection of their voice, or if they always wore a particular pair of sneakers or what have you. He would use those as individual markers of that person rather than looking for distinguishing features of their face, right? So this is again a disorder of prosopagnosia that results from damage to the FFA. So collectively, the fact that people who damage this region of the brain are no longer able to recognize faces, and the fact that it shows increased brain activation when we're viewing pictures of faces, seems to suggest that yes, the fusiform face area is in fact specialized for perception of faces. But that's not the whole story. So for example, in one particular set of experiments, researchers compared bird watching experts. So individuals who had at least 1,000 hours of bird watching experience to novices who had never bird watched before. And they found some interesting things. So for example, they took non-experts and expert bird watchers and put them in an fMRI machine and had them look at various types of pictures. So interestingly, when they compared experts and non-experts, when they were looking at regular objects, they found that, as expected, there was no activation in the fusiform face area, so that would make sense. And similarly, when they took experts and non-experts and put them in a brain scanner and had them both look at faces, both experts and non-expert bird watchers showed increased activation in the FFA. But interestingly, when you showed pictures of birds to bird watching experts and non-experts, they found that for the experts, for the bird watching experts, they did show increased activation in the FFA, whereas novices or non-experts did not. Similarly, if you take people who spend a lot of time looking at different cars, so for example, mechanics and I don't know what the word would be, but people who are sort of hobbyists who spend a lot of time going to car shows and so forth, they found again that when they showed them the hoods of various cars, they showed activation in the FFA, whereas non-experts or non-hobbyists or non-mechanics did not. And so what this suggests is that rather than being a region of the brain specific to visual recognition of faces, what the FFA seems to be is an area of the temporal lobe that specializes in recognition of something that we have a lot of experience looking at or a lot of expertise looking at, right? And that would make sense because in a way, we're all face experts, right? Before we even, pretty much right after we open our eyes, when we're born, we're already sort of innately endowed with the intent to attempt to find faces and focus on faces in an effort to stimulate, attachment and bonding and so forth. So really, for the entirety of our lives, we are extremely motivated to seek out and recognize faces. So it would make sense that this particular region would show activation whenever we see a face because of all of that experience. But it also shows activation for other visual stimuli that we have a lot of experience looking at. Okay? So that's our first brain region that seems to show evidence of specialization of function. There is also another region of the temporal lobe called the parahippocampal place area. And if we stick people into a brain scanner and show them pictures of places or indoor and outdoor scenes, they show increased activation in this particular region. Whereas they don't show increased activation when they're looking at everyday objects, right? So again, we have evidence that there's another brain region that seems to be specialized in perception of indoor and outdoor scenes in the parahippocampal place area. Similarly, we have the EBA, which responds specifically to pictures of parts of bodies, right? So when you show people an arm and a leg and various figures showing body parts, they show activation in this region, whereas they don't when they're looking at faces or other ordinary objects. Okay, so perhaps the most famous example of brain structures that illustrate specialization of function are Brocas area and Wernicke's area. So these regions are structures in the brain that are have been demonstrated to be responsible for speech production and speech comprehension, respectively. Okay. So Brocas area and Wernicke's area were both discovered by physicians of the same name in the 1800s. So we'll start with Paul Broca. So Paul Broca was a French physician who was working at a hospital for the clinically insane in Paris when he came upon a patient that's referred to in the literature by Le Borgne. And I assume Le Borgne is the patient's last name. So again, Le Borgne was a patient of Broca's. He was almost completely unable to produce any words or phrases, and that remained the same in the 15 years that he was a patient of Broca's. So he was able to repeat the word tan, okay, which he became known as Monsieur Tan. And after his death, when Broca did an autopsy, he discovered that there was a lesion on the surface of his frontal lobe. Okay. Similarly, Broca had another patient who was also referred to in the clinical literature by his last name, and this was Lalonde. And Lalonde had good cognitive abilities otherwise, but he was unable to speak clearly. So like Le Borgne, he could say only a few words. So for example, he could say yes, no, three, always, and Lilo, which was a mispronunciation of his own name, Lalonde. So again, when Paul Broca did an autopsy after Lilo or Lalonde's death, he discovered a lesion or damage to the same area of the frontal lobe. And so after that, this area became known as Broca's area, and there were numerous other similar autopsies that revealed difficulties with speech production. Wernicke, like Paul Broca, so Wernicke later observed a patient. So his first case, I believe, was in 1905. So it was after Paul Broca's work, but he observed a patient with poor speech comprehension, but good speech production, right? So it was essentially the exact inverse of what Paul Broca found, right? Okay, so collectively we have in the frontal lobe, Brocas area, which became known as the speech production center, and Wernicke's area, which became known as the speech comprehension center. And you guys have already seen examples or videos of individuals who have Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia respectively, so you can sort of see how these disorders manifest. So we'll see in the next video that this picture is slightly more complicated. So there are actually many regions of the brain that correspond to speech, various aspects of speech, both speech comprehension and speech production. But there's at least some evidence for some degree of specialization of function, which is why I included it here. Okay, so that concludes our review of brain structures illustrating specialization of function. And in my next video, I will talk about the idea of distributed representation. So essentially the opposite of specialization of function, or the notion that there are multiple regions of the brain that become activated or show patterns of activation at the same time whenever we're engaging in complex cognition. Okay, so I'll see you guys in my next video.